Have you ever felt like giving up on learning English? Like the words move too fast and the world around you never slows down? Now imagine arriving alone in New York City, struggling to understand people, struggling to belong, and somehow finding love, family, and confidence along the way. In this slow, real English story, I will share how surviving a busy city unexpectedly taught me the language of life and the language of the heart. Arrival in busy New York. Have you ever landed somewhere so loud, so fast, and so confusing that your brain quietly whispers, maybe this was a terrible idea? That was exactly how my story in New York City began. The first morning I stepped outside my tiny apartment in Queens, the air felt different. Not bad, just busy. The subway rumbled underground like a restless animal. Yellow taxis rushed past like they were late for something very important. People walked fast, talked fast, ordered coffee fast, and somehow seemed to understand everything around them. And me? I stood on the sidewalk holding my phone, staring at a map, pretending I knew what I was doing. "Excuse me," someone said behind me. I turned around too quickly. A man in a suit pointed politely. "You're blocking the door." "Oh, sorry," I said. My English sounded careful, slow, like every word had to pass through a small security gate in my brain before it could leave my mouth. He nodded and disappeared into the building. Conversation over. 5 seconds. That was my first real conversation in New York. Welcome to America. The funny thing about moving to a big city is that millions of people are around you, yet loneliness can feel louder than the traffic. That first week, I heard English everywhere, on buses, in grocery stores, and elevators on the subway, but my brain caught only half the words. It felt like trying to drink water from a fire hose. Fast English is terrifying when you're learning. Linguists actually explain this with something called processing speed. Your brain needs time to hear a word, recognize it, connect it to meaning, and respond. Native speakers do this automatically. Learners? Our brains are still building the roads. So when someone says something like, "Hey, how are ya doing today?" your brain hears, "Hey, how what today?" Meanwhile, the person is already walking away. This is why so many people quit learning English. Not because they are lazy. Not because they are not smart. Because the experience can feel humiliating. One evening that first week, I sat alone in my small room. The window looked out onto another building wall only a few meters away. New York apartments are famous for that. I opened my laptop and searched something simple. Slow English listening practice. Video after video appeared. People speaking slowly, clearly, calmly. And suddenly I had a strange idea. What if I practiced speaking English the same way but with my own story? So that night, I began talking to myself. Quietly at first. "My name is, well, you know my name," I said, laughing at how ridiculous I sounded. I came to New York to start a new life. My voice echoed slightly in the small room. It felt awkward, embarrassing. But something interesting happened after 10 minutes. My brain relaxed. Psychologists call this low-pressure language production. When you speak without fear of judgment, your brain forms connections faster. No stress. No audience. Just practice. So I continued. "I walked in Manhattan today," I said slowly. "The buildings are very tall. The people walk very fast. I think New York drinks coffee instead of water." I laughed again. And right there, in that tiny room, something shifted inside me. English was no longer a test. It became a story. The next morning I went outside again. Same noisy street. Same rushing people. Same confusing subway map. But I had a small experiment. Instead of trying to understand everything, I focused on just one sentence. When I bought coffee, I practiced, "Can I get a small coffee, please?" The barista nodded.
Sure.
Anything else? My brain froze for half a second, then remembered my plan. No, that's all. Thank you. The whole exchange lasted maybe 10 seconds. But something powerful happened. My brain recorded a success. Neuroscience shows that small wins release dopamine, the brain's motivation chemical. When learning feels rewarding, the brain wants to repeat the behavior. So the next day, I ordered coffee again. Same sentence. Same practice. Within a week, the barista started recognizing me. Small coffee guy, he joked. I smiled.
Yes.
That's me. New York was still loud, still chaotic, still confusing. But slowly, very slowly, it became a classroom. Every subway announcement was listening practice. Every coffee order was speaking practice. Every conversation I overheard was a puzzle piece. And here's the strange part. The more I practiced English slowly, the less lonely I felt. Because language is not just grammar. It's connection. And connection, even small ones like a 10-second conversation about coffee, can change how a city feels. That first month in New York, I didn't know it yet, but something important was beginning. Not just my journey of learning English through real life. Not just my struggle to survive in a busy city, but the beginning of a story I never expected. A story about culture, about family, about building a life in a place that once felt impossible. And most surprising of all, a story about finding love in the loudest city in America. Because sometimes the place where you feel the most lost is exactly where your real story begins. Lonely nights, slow English. Night in New York can feel strange when you're new to the city. During the day, everything moves fast, people rushing to work, taxis honking, subway doors opening and closing like impatient robots. But at night, when you return to a small apartment and close the door, the silence suddenly becomes very loud. That was the moment when loneliness usually visited me. My apartment was small, very small. The kitchen was almost inside the living room, and the living room was almost inside the bedroom. If you stretched your arms, you could almost touch two walls at the same time. But that tiny room became something unexpected for me. It became my English practice studio. The first nights were difficult. I remember sitting at the small table with a bowl of instant noodles, listening to people talking in the hallway outside. Their English was fast, natural, relaxed. My brain could catch pieces of it, but not everything. Meeting tomorrow? I told him already. Subway was crazy today. Small fragments, like broken puzzle pieces. And that feeling, understanding a little but not enough, can be very frustrating for English learners. Psychologists call this the comprehension gap. It happens when your brain knows some vocabulary but cannot process real conversations quickly enough. This gap can make people feel tired and discouraged. In fact, many language learners stop practicing exactly at this stage. But something interesting happened to me. Instead of turning off the noise, I started using it. One night, while washing dishes, I heard two neighbors talking outside.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today. I paused. Then I repeated quietly to myself.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today.
Slowly. Carefully.
Again.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today. Something magical happens when you repeat real sentences you hear in daily life. Your brain begins to store natural language patterns, not just vocabulary. This method is sometimes called shadowing in language learning. You hear a sentence, then repeat it out loud, trying to copy the rhythm and pronunciation. At first, I sounded like a robot learning emotions. I am exhausted today. But every night, I improved a little. Soon, my nightly routine became almost funny. Picture this scene. It's 10:30 p.m. in a quiet apartment building in Queens. Most people are relaxing after work. And inside one tiny apartment, there is a man slowly talking to himself. Today was a busy day.
Pause.
Today was a very busy day.
Pause.
I walked a lot in Manhattan today. Sometimes I even added dramatic acting, like I was performing a one-person movie. I walked 20 blocks, I would say with fake exhaustion. My legs are tired. Then I would laugh at myself. But here's the secret many people don't realize. Your brain learns faster when learning feels playful. Research in neuroscience shows that relaxed emotional states improve memory formation. When you laugh or feel curious, your brain releases chemicals that help information stick. So those silly conversations with myself were actually powerful learning sessions. One night, I tried something new. Instead of repeating sentences, I told my own story in simple English. Today I got lost on the subway, I said. That happens a lot. I took the wrong train again. I imagined someone listening to me. Maybe a friend. Maybe you. My phone battery died. I continued slowly. So, I asked someone for directions. I paused, remembering the moment. The man had spoken quickly, but I remembered one sentence clearly. Take the downtown train. So, I repeated it again in my room. Take the downtown train. Slow English.
Clear English.
Real English. And something surprising happened during those lonely nights. My confidence began growing quietly. Language learning experts often say confidence comes after fluency. But in reality, confidence usually comes before fluency. The moment you believe you can communicate, even imperfectly, your brain becomes braver. One evening, about 2 weeks after I started this routine, I noticed a small change. I was thinking in English. Not full sentences yet. Just small thoughts. Too cold today. Need coffee. Subway crowded. But those tiny thoughts were important. Because thinking in a language means your brain is building a direct connection between ideas and words. Without translating from your native language. That's when learning begins to accelerate. And strangely, those quiet nights also changed how I felt emotionally. Loneliness slowly turned into reflection. Instead of feeling like a stranger in a big city, I started feeling like a character inside a story. A slow story. A story about survival. A story about growth. And maybe, just maybe, a story about something unexpected waiting ahead. Because sometimes when life feels quiet and lonely, something new is quietly preparing to enter your life. At that moment, I didn't know it yet. But very soon, my daily English practice would move out of my apartment and into a small coffee shop where one simple conversation would begin changing everything. Not just my English, but my life. And the next chapter of this story would begin with something very ordinary in New York. A cup of coffee. Lonely nights, slow English. Night in New York can feel strange when you're new to the city. During the day, everything moves fast. People rushing to work, taxis honking, subway doors opening and closing like impatient robots. But at night, when you return to a small apartment and close the door, the silence suddenly becomes very loud. That was the moment when loneliness usually visited me. My apartment was small. Very small. The kitchen was almost inside the living room, and the living room was almost inside the bedroom. If you stretched your arms, you could almost touch two walls at the same time. But that tiny room became something unexpected for me. It became my English practice studio. The first nights were difficult. I remember sitting at the small table with a bowl of instant noodles, listening to people talking in the hallway outside. Their English was fast, natural, relaxed. My brain could catch pieces of it, but not everything. Meeting tomorrow? I told him already. Subway was crazy today. Small fragments, like broken puzzle pieces. And that feeling, understanding a little but not enough, can be very frustrating for English learners. Psychologists call this the comprehension gap. It happens when your brain knows some vocabulary but cannot process real conversations quickly enough. This gap can make people feel tired and discouraged. In fact, many language learners stop practicing exactly at this stage. But something interesting happened to me. Instead of turning off the noise, I started using it. One night, while washing dishes, I heard two neighbors talking outside.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today. I paused. Then I repeated quietly to myself.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today.
Slowly. Carefully.
Again.
I'm exhausted.
Work was insane today. Something magical happens when you repeat real sentences you hear in daily life. Your brain begins to store natural language patterns, not just vocabulary. This method is sometimes called shadowing in language learning. You hear a sentence, then repeat it out loud, trying to copy the rhythm and pronunciation. At first, I sounded like a robot learning emotions. I am exhausted today. But every night, I improved a little. Soon, my nightly routine became almost funny. Picture this scene. It's 10:30 p.m. in a quiet apartment building in Queens. Most people are relaxing after work. And inside one tiny apartment, there is a man slowly talking to himself. Today was a busy day.
Pause.
Today was a very busy day.
Pause.
I walked a lot in Manhattan today. Sometimes I even added dramatic acting, like I was performing a one-person movie. I walked 20 blocks, I would say with fake exhaustion. My legs are tired. Then I would laugh at myself. But here's the secret many people don't realize. Your brain learns faster when learning feels playful. Research in neuroscience shows that relaxed emotional states improve memory formation. When you laugh or feel curious, your brain releases chemicals that help information stick. So those silly conversations with myself were actually powerful learning sessions. One night, I tried something new. Instead of repeating sentences, I told my own story in simple English. Today I got lost on the subway, I said. That happens a lot. I took the wrong train again. I imagined someone listening to me. Maybe a friend. Maybe you. My phone battery died. I continued slowly. So, I asked someone for directions. I paused, remembering the moment. The man had spoken quickly. But I remembered one sentence clearly. Take the downtown train. So, I repeated it again in my room. Take the downtown train. Slow English.
Clear English.
Real English. And something surprising happened during those lonely nights. My confidence began growing quietly. Language learning experts often say confidence comes after fluency. But in reality, confidence usually comes before fluency. The moment you believe you can communicate, even imperfectly, your brain becomes braver. One evening, about 2 weeks after I started this routine, I noticed a small change. I was thinking in English. Not full sentences yet. Just small thoughts. Too cold today. Need coffee. Subway crowded. But those tiny thoughts were important. Because thinking in a language means your brain is building a direct connection between ideas and words. Without translating from your native language, That's when learning begins to accelerate. And strangely, those quiet nights also changed how I felt emotionally. Loneliness slowly turned into reflection. Instead of feeling like a stranger in a big city, I started feeling like a character inside a story. A slow story. A story about survival. A story about growth. And maybe, just maybe, a story about something unexpected waiting ahead. Because sometimes when life feels quiet and lonely, something new is quietly preparing to enter your life. At that moment, I didn't know it yet. But very soon, my daily English practice would move out of my apartment and into a small coffee shop where one simple conversation would begin changing everything. Not just my English, but my life. And the next chapter of the story would begin with something very ordinary in New York, a cup of coffee. Cultural shock everywhere. Most people think the hardest part of moving to a new country is the language. But after a few weeks in New York, I realized something surprising. The language was only half the challenge. The other half was culture. You see, language is not just words. Language is also habits, expectations, jokes, timing, body language, and thousands of invisible social rules that nobody explains to you. And when you arrive in a new culture, those invisible rules suddenly become very visible. For example, the first time someone asked me this question in the coffee shop, "How's it going?" I started answering honestly. Well, today is a little difficult because I am still learning the subway system and my apartment heater is very loud. And also, the person had already walked away. Later I learned something important about American culture. "How's it going?" is often not a real question. It is a friendly greeting. The expected answer is short. Good. Pretty good. Not bad. That's it. Conversation finished. At first, this felt strange to me. In many cultures, if someone asks how you are, they expect a real answer. In the United States, sometimes it's simply social rhythm. This is why cultural understanding is extremely important in language learning. Linguists call this pragmatic competence, the ability to know not just what words mean, but how they are used in real situations. And New York was full of these cultural puzzles. Take personal space, for example. In the subway during rush hour, personal space disappears completely. People stand shoulder to shoulder like books on a crowded shelf. But in normal conversations outside the subway, Americans often keep a little distance while talking. If you stand too close, people slowly lean backward. If you stand too far away, they lean forward. Your brain suddenly becomes a social GPS system trying to find the correct distance. Another cultural surprise was how directly people spoke. One afternoon in the coffee shop, a customer took a sip of his drink and said to the barista, "This is too sweet."
Just like that.
Simple.
Direct.
In some cultures, people might say something softer like, "Maybe it's a little sweet for me." But in many American situations, direct communication is normal and efficient. At first I wondered if people were being rude. But over time I realized something important. Direct communication is not always rude. Sometimes it is simply clear. Psychologists say cultures often fall somewhere between high context and low context communication. High context cultures rely heavily on indirect meaning, tone, and shared understanding. Low context cultures, like much of the United States, prefer clear and explicit communication. Once I understood this, many conversations suddenly made more sense. But culture shock also appeared in everyday life in funny ways. Take grocery shopping. The first time I entered an American supermarket, I stood frozen in front of the cereal aisle for almost 5 minutes.
Why?
Because there were about 50 different cereal options. Back home, there might be 5. In New York, there were cereals with chocolate, cereals with marshmallows, cereals with protein, cereals with organic oats. Cereals shaped like tiny animals, cereals promising happiness, strength, or a better morning. My brain thought, why so many choices? Psychologists actually have a term for this. Choice overload. When humans face too many options, decision-making becomes harder, not easier. So after staring at colorful cereal boxes for several minutes, I made a very scientific decision. I picked the cheapest one. Problem solved. Then there were the weather surprises. New York weather changes its personality very quickly. In the morning, the sun can feel warm and friendly. By afternoon, the wind suddenly feels like it came directly from the Arctic.
And winter?
Winter in New York is not just cold. It is serious cold. The first snowstorm I experienced felt magical for exactly 20 minutes. Snow falling gently from the sky. Buildings covered in white. Streets looking peaceful and quiet. Then reality arrived. Slippery sidewalks. Frozen fingers. Wind that somehow finds its way inside every jacket. I remember standing at a bus stop thinking slowly in English. This city is beautiful, but it is trying to freeze me. But even with all these cultural surprises, something inside me was slowly changing. Instead of feeling like an outsider observing a strange world, I started feeling curious. Every cultural difference became a lesson. Every awkward moment became a story. And one place in particular was quietly helping me understand American culture better than any textbook ever could. The coffee shop. Because that's where people spoke naturally, where they laughed about work, complained about weather, talked about relationships. And that new barista, the one with the calm eyes and warm smile, was about to become my unexpected cultural guide. At first our conversations were simple. Coffee orders, short greetings, a few friendly questions. But slowly, something deeper began growing. Because sometimes learning a language is not only about vocabulary. Sometimes it's about meeting the one person who makes you want to keep talking. And very soon, that person would ask me a simple question that would start changing everything. A question that sounded ordinary, but would quietly open the door to the most important chapter of my life in New York. The girl with warm eyes. Sometimes life changes direction in the most ordinary places. Not in dramatic movie scenes. Not in perfect romantic moments. But in a small coffee shop on a normal morning while you're just trying to order coffee in careful English. That morning began exactly like all the others. The cold air of New York brushed against my face as I pushed open the glass door of the coffee shop. The little bell above the door rang softly. Inside, the familiar smell of roasted coffee filled the room. But something felt different. She was behind the counter again, the new barista I had noticed the day before. Dark hair tied loosely behind her head. Calm eyes. The kind of eyes that looked like they were always quietly observing the world. When it was my turn, she smiled politely.
Good morning, she said.
My brain quickly searched for my practice sentence. Good morning, can I get a small coffee, please? She nodded and began preparing the drink. But this time, instead of simply handing the cup to me, she asked another question. So, you come here every morning, right? Her English was clear, but natural. Not slow like my practice videos. Real-life speed. For a moment, my brain needed an extra second to process the sentence. Yes, I answered slowly. Almost every morning. She placed the lid on the cup and slid it across the counter. That's dedication, she said with a small laugh. I smiled, not fully sure if I understood the word dedication, but I guessed the meaning.
I liker kaffe, I replid.
She laughed a little more. But then something interesting happened. Instead of the conversation ending like usual, she leaned slightly on the counter. So, where are you from? She asked. Now this was a familiar question. Language learners hear it a lot. but answering it always felt like a small test. I'm from Vietnam, I said carefully. Her eyes brightened with curiosity. Oh wow, that's far from New York. Yes, I said. Very far. There was a short pause, but not an uncomfortable one. Then she asked something that surprised me. How long have you been learning English? This question felt different. Not judgmental. Not impatient. Just curious. About 2 years, I said slowly. But real-life English, maybe only a few months. She nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Then she said something that stayed in my mind for a long time. You're doing really well. Now, objectively speaking, my English was still simple. My grammar was not perfect. My speaking speed was slow. But encouragement can be powerful. Studies in educational psychology show that positive feedback increases learner persistence. When people believe their effort is working, they are more likely to continue. Her small compliment acted like fuel for my motivation.
Thank you, I said.
I took my coffee and sat at my usual table near the window. But something was different that morning. Instead of just listening to conversations around me, I found myself thinking about our short exchange. Her voice, her questions, her smile. And most interestingly, my brain replayed the conversation in English. So, where are you from? I'm from Vietnam. How long have you been learning English? About 2 years. This replay process is actually very helpful for language learning. Researchers call it mental rehearsal. Your brain strengthens memory pathways by revisiting conversations after they happen. So, I repeated the dialogue quietly in my mind while sipping coffee. Later that week, something unexpected happened again. I walked into the coffee shop, and before I even reached the counter, she said, "Good morning, Vietnam." For a moment, I blinked in surprise. Then I realized she was joking. It was a reference to an old American movie called Good Morning, Vietnam. I had heard of it but never watched it. I laughed. "Good morning," I replied. The moment felt light and friendly. From that day forward, our conversations slowly grew longer. Nothing dramatic, just small daily moments. How's your day going? Cold outside today. Busy morning? But each conversation helped me practice real English interaction. Unlike scripted dialogues in textbooks, these conversations had pauses, jokes, small misunderstandings, and natural rhythm. Sometimes I didn't understand everything she said. Sometimes I asked her to repeat. "Sorry, can you say that again?" And every time she patiently repeated the sentence. Language teachers often emphasize something important. Conversation partners accelerate language learning more than solo study. Because real conversations force your brain to process language in real time. And that's exactly what was happening. But something else was happening too. Something I didn't fully realize at first. I started looking forward to those conversations. Every morning, the walk to the coffee shop felt shorter. The city felt a little less lonely. And the practice of speaking English began to feel less like work and more like connection. One morning, while I was writing sentences in my notebook near the window, she walked over during a quiet moment.
She pointed at the notebook.
"You study here every day?" I nodded.
Yes.
"I practice English." She looked genuinely impressed. "That's actually really cool." Then she asked a question that would quietly change our story. "What are you writing today?" I hesitated for a moment. Then I showed her the page. On it, I had written a simple sentence. "New York is loud, but sometimes it is also kind." She read the sentence slowly. Then she smiled. "I like that," she said. And right there, in that small coffee shop, something began growing. Not fast. Not dramatic.
Just slowly.
Like language itself. Because sometimes the person who helps you practice a new language becomes the person you most want to talk to. And very soon, our simple coffee shop conversations would turn into something neither of us expected. Something deeper than language practice. Something that New York, strangely enough, makes possible even in its busiest corners. The beginning of a connection. And maybe the beginning of love. Learning love through language. There is something funny about learning a language through conversation. At first, you're just trying to survive. You search for the right word. You worry about grammar. Your brain works like a slow computer loading each sentence. But slowly something changes. The language stops feeling like a puzzle and starts feeling like a bridge. That was exactly what began happening between me and the barista with the warm eyes. Her name, I eventually learned, was Emily. It happened during a quiet afternoon in the coffee shop. There were fewer customers than usual. Soft music played in the background, and outside the window the gray New York sky looked like it was thinking about rain. I walked to the counter, like always. "Hi, Emily," I said carefully. My pronunciation of her name still felt a little slow, but she smiled when she heard it. "Hey," she replied. "The usual coffee?" "Yes," I said. "Small coffee, please." She prepared the drink, but instead of moving quickly to the next customer, she stayed there for a moment. "So, how is your English practice going?" she asked. This was a question I had thought about many times. I answered honestly. "Slow," I said, laughing slightly. "But better." She nodded. "That's how languages work," she said. "Slow at first, then suddenly your brain surprises you." What she said was actually very accurate. Language researchers describe this as the plateau effect. When learning a new skill, progress often feels slow for a long time. But behind the scenes, the brain is quietly building connections. Then suddenly, improvement becomes visible. But what made those conversations with Emily special was not just language practice. It was comfort. When you talk with someone who is patient, your brain relaxes. The fear of making mistakes disappears. And when fear disappears, communication becomes natural. One afternoon, she sat down at the table near the window during her break. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "Of course," I said. For a moment, we both looked outside at the busy street. Then she asked something personal. "What made you move to New York?" This was not a simple small talk question. It required a real story. So I took a deep breath and answered slowly. "I wanted a new life," I said. "And also, I wanted to improve my English." She smiled softly. "That's a brave reason." I wasn't sure if I felt brave. Most of the time, I just felt confused by subway maps. But hearing her say that made the journey feel meaningful. "And you?" I asked carefully. "Did you grow up in New York?" She shook her head. "No. I'm from upstate. Much quieter than this city." She gestured toward the busy street outside. "New York is exciting," she continued, "but it can also be exhausting." I understood that feeling very well. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes the city feels like it is running, and I am walking behind." She laughed. "That's actually a perfect description." Then she asked something that made the conversation even more interesting. "Do you ever think in English now?" This question made me pause. "Sometimes," I said. "Small thoughts." "Like what?" I thought for a moment. "Like, I need coffee." She laughed. "That's very New York." Moments like that were powerful for my learning. Because humor is a natural part of language. When you understand a joke or make someone laugh, it means you are starting to think inside the language. Psychologists say laughter during learning creates strong emotional memory links. Your brain remembers moments connected to emotion much longer. But something else was also happening during those conversations. I started noticing details about her. The way she tilted her head slightly when listening. The way her eyes softened when she laughed. The calm energy she carried even when the shop became busy. At first, I didn't think much about it. But the human brain is very good at recognizing emotional patterns. And slowly, my brain started forming a simple thought. I liked talking to her. A lot. One evening, after the coffee shop closed, I was still sitting by the window finishing my notes. She walked over while cleaning the counter. "You're still studying?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "English homework." She leaned on the counter. "You know," she said, "most people wouldn't have the patience to practice every day like this." I shrugged. "I think if you want to belong somewhere, you must learn the language." She looked thoughtful for a moment. Then she said something very simple but very meaningful. "You already belong here more than you think." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Because sometimes encouragement carries more emotion than long speeches. Finally, she smiled again. "Hey," she said, "do you want to practice English outside the coffee shop sometime?" My brain took a moment to process the sentence. "Outside the coffee shop?" "Yes," she continued casually. "Maybe a walk in the park. Or dinner. Good conversation practice." She said it lightly, almost like a joke. But something in her eyes suggested she meant it. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Speaking English in a coffee shop was one thing. Speaking English during a walk together? That felt like a much bigger challenge. But at the same time, it felt like an opportunity. Because sometimes language learning opens unexpected doors. Doors to friendship, to connection, and sometimes, if you're lucky, to love. And very soon, our English conversations would move beyond the coffee shop walls, into the streets of New York, into long walks, into deeper stories, and into a chapter of life that would test both my language skills and my heart. Winter, doubt, and distance. If you want to understand New York City, you must experience it in winter. Not the pretty winter you see in holiday movies. Not the soft snow falling gently while people drink hot chocolate. Real New York winter is colder, louder, and sometimes a little lonely. By the time December arrived, the city had changed its personality. The wind rushed between tall buildings like it was trying to win a race. The sidewalks turned slippery. People walked faster than ever, their faces half hidden behind scarves and hats. And somehow, winter made everything feel quieter inside. Even my morning routine at the coffee shop felt different. The windows fogged up from the warm air inside. Customers came in quickly, ordered their drinks, and hurried back into the cold streets. But Emily was still there behind the counter, moving calmly through the morning rush. "Good morning, Vietnam," she joked when I walked in one snowy day. I smiled, brushing snow from my jacket. "Good morning," I replied. "It is very cold today." "Welcome to New York winter," she said. But winter did something else too. It brought doubt. This is something many language learners experience. At the beginning, everything feels exciting. New country, new language, new experiences. But after a few months, the brain becomes tired. Psychologists sometimes call this the motivation dip. The excitement fades, and progress suddenly feels slower. That's exactly what happened to me. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my notebook and stared at the sentences I had written. They looked simple. Too simple. I went to the store today. The subway was crowded. I drank coffee. My brain suddenly thought, is this enough? Will I ever speak English fluently? Will I ever feel truly comfortable in this city? Outside my window, the wind pushed snow across the streetlights like tiny white storms. For the first time since arriving in New York, I felt the heavy weight of uncertainty. Learning a language takes time. Living in a new culture takes energy. And sometimes the distance from home becomes louder during quiet nights. I thought about my family. Different time zone. different life, thousands of miles away. The truth is, winter doesn't just change the weather. It changes how people feel. Scientists explain this partly through seasonal mood changes. Shorter daylight hours and colder temperatures can lower energy levels and motivation. Even native New Yorkers complain about it. And for someone still adjusting to a new life, those feelings can become stronger. The next morning, I almost skipped my coffee shop routine. But habits are powerful. Psychologists say habits reduce the need for motivation. When something becomes routine, you do it automatically. So even though I felt tired and discouraged, my feet still carried me down the familiar street. The bell rang when I opened the coffee shop door. Emily looked up immediately. "Hey, you look cold," she said. "Very cold," I replied. She handed me a cup before I even ordered. "On the house today," she said. I blinked in surprise. "You don't have to do that." She shrugged. "Consider it winter survival support." I laughed softly, but something in my face must have looked different that day because she studied me for a moment. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. I hesitated. Language learners often avoid emotional conversations because they require more vocabulary. But something about her question felt sincere. So I answered honestly. I feel a little lost today." She nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what that meant. "New York can do that to people," she said. Then she added something important. "But it doesn't last forever." She sat across from me for a few minutes during a quiet moment in the shop. "Learning a language is weird," she said. "It feels slow, until suddenly it isn't." I looked at my coffee. "I still speak very simple English," I admitted. She shook her head. "You communicate clearly," she said. "That matters more than perfect grammar." This idea is supported by many language experts. The main goal of communication is understanding, not perfection. But learners often focus so much on mistakes that they forget the real purpose of language, connecting with people. Emily understood that instinctively. After a few minutes, she said something unexpected. When I first moved to the city, I felt lost too." "You?" I asked, surprised. She nodded. "Different reasons, same feeling." For a moment we both looked out the foggy window at the snowy street. Two people in the same city, both trying to find their place. Then she smiled. "So here's the deal," she said. "What deal?" "You keep practicing your English, and I'll keep practicing my patience listening to it." I laughed. "That sounds fair." That simple joke lifted something heavy inside my chest. Sometimes encouragement doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to arrive at the right moment. And as winter continued, something interesting happened. Our conversations grew longer. Our walks after the coffee shop closed became more frequent. And the distance between two people from very different worlds slowly began to disappear. But winter was not finished testing us yet, because soon a new challenge would appear. One that would ask a very simple question. Could two people from different cultures, different backgrounds, and different life stories build something real together in the busiest city in the world? The answer would begin with one small promise. A promise spoken in simple English. A small English promise. Some promises in life are dramatic. They happen in movies under bright lights, with music playing in the background and people watching. But the promises that change real lives are usually much quieter. Ours happened on a cold evening in early January on a street corner in Queens, with snow melting slowly along the sidewalk. That night the coffee shop had closed earlier than usual because of a winter storm warning. The streets were calmer than normal, and the air carried that strange silence that comes just before heavy snow. Emily locked the glass door and turned the sign to closed. "You heading home?" she asked. "Yes," I said, pulling my jacket tighter around my neck. But then she looked at the sky and smiled slightly. "Want to walk a little first?" she asked. In that moment, my brain quickly reviewed two things. First, my English speaking ability. Second, the weather. Both seemed slightly risky, but sometimes life rewards small courage. "Okay," I said. We began walking slowly down the street. Snowflakes started appearing again, drifting gently through the yellow streetlights. For a few minutes we walked quietly. Not an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that happens when two people are thinking. Finally, she asked something simple. "So, what's the hardest part of learning English for you?" I thought carefully before answering. Many learners say grammar is the hardest part, but for me, the answer was different. "Confidence," I said. She glanced at me. "Confidence?" "Yes," I continued slowly. "Sometimes I know the words, but I'm afraid to say them." She nodded immediately. "That makes sense." Fear of speaking is actually one of the biggest barriers in language learning. Linguists call it communication anxiety. The brain worries about making mistakes, being misunderstood, or sounding strange. So even when learners know the vocabulary, they stay silent. Emily kicked a small piece of snow off the sidewalk. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Of course." "You speak more bravely than many people I know." I blinked in surprise. "Really?" She nodded. "You moved to another country. You practice every day. You talk to strangers in a second language." She looked at me and shrugged. "That's bravery." Sometimes hearing your own story from someone else's perspective changes how you see yourself. I had been focusing on what I couldn't do. She was noticing what I was already doing. We reached a small park nearby. The benches were covered with a thin layer of fresh snow. We sat down carefully. Cold air filled the quiet space around us. After a moment, she asked another question. "Do you ever think about staying in New York long term?" The question surprised me. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Why?" I looked at the snowy ground. "Because building a life here is difficult," I explained. "New culture, new language, everything new." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something simple, but thoughtful. "Yeah, but sometimes the hardest places to build a life are also the most rewarding." That sentence stayed in my mind. The wind moved softly through the park trees. I realized something in that moment. This city, which once felt overwhelming and impossible, had slowly given me something unexpected. A routine, a sense of belonging, and a person sitting beside me who understood my journey. Suddenly, the conversation felt more personal. I turned to her and asked something I had been curious about. "Why did you invite me to walk tonight?" She smiled slightly, like she had been expecting the question. "Because," she said, "I like our conversations." A simple answer. But sometimes simplicity carries the most honesty. "You are patient when I speak," I said. "That helps me." She laughed softly. "You're patient too," she replied. "With what?" "With my endless coffee." We both laughed. The cold air made the moment feel strangely peaceful. Then she looked at me seriously. "Let's make a deal," she said. "What kind of deal?" She held up one finger like she was making an important announcement. "You keep practicing English with me." "That sounds easy," I said. Then she held up a second finger. "And I promise to help you feel less lost in New York." I considered the idea. Language partner, city guide, friend. It sounded like a very good agreement. "Okay," I said slowly. "Deal." She extended her hand. I shook it. A small handshake. A small promise. But sometimes the smallest promises grow into the biggest changes. Because after that evening, our time together expanded beyond coffee shop conversations. We explored streets together, visited small parks, talked about culture, food, family, and dreams. My English improved faster. Her curiosity about my world grew stronger. And without either of us saying it directly, something deeper started forming. A connection that was no longer just about language practice. But winter in New York was slowly ending. And when spring arrives in the city, everything changes. The streets become brighter. The parks fill with people. And hearts that survived the cold season sometimes become brave enough to ask new questions. Questions about the future. Questions about love. And very soon, one of those questions would quietly appear between us. A question that would change our story forever. Family, culture, and understanding. Spring in New York is like the city taking a deep breath after a long winter. Suddenly, the gray streets become brighter. Trees in the parks grow small green leaves. People sit outside cafes again, talking and laughing like they have just remembered that warm weather exists. For me, spring also brought something new. My English conversations with Emily were no longer just practice. They had become part of my daily life. By that time, we were meeting not only at the coffee shop but also on weekends. Sometimes we walked through small parks in Queens. Sometimes we explored busy streets in Manhattan. And with every conversation, our topics slowly became deeper. At the beginning we talked about simple things. Weather.
Food.
Funny subway stories. But language has an interesting way of opening doors. Once two people feel comfortable speaking together, the conversation naturally moves toward more personal subjects. One afternoon we were sitting on a bench in Central Park. The air was warm, and the park was full of people walking dogs, playing music, and enjoying the sunshine. Emily took a sip of iced coffee and asked something thoughtful. "Do you miss home?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. "Yes," I said quietly. "Every day." She nodded slowly. "Tell me about your family." That question made me pause, not because I didn't want to answer, but because explaining family in another language requires both vocabulary and emotion. "My parents live in Vietnam," I began slowly. "They are very supportive, but they worry about me living so far away." "That makes sense," she said gently. I smiled. "In my culture, family stays very close," I explained. "Even when people grow up, family decisions are still important." Emily leaned back slightly, thinking. "That's interesting," she said. "In the U.S., people often become very independent after high school or college." She was right. In many Western cultures, independence is considered a major life milestone. Young adults move out, build careers, and make personal decisions without always consulting family. In many Asian cultures, family connections remain stronger and more involved. Neither system is right or wrong. They are simply different cultural values. And understanding these differences is extremely important in relationships. Psychologists call this cultural awareness, the ability to recognize that people's behaviors and expectations are shaped by their cultural background. Without that awareness, misunderstandings can easily happen. But with awareness, differences become opportunities to learn. Emily seemed genuinely curious. "So, when you make big life decisions," she asked, "do you usually talk with your family first?" "Yes," I said. "Especially about important things." "Like career?" "Yes." "Like where to live?" "Yes." She hesitated slightly. "And relationships?" I smiled a little. "Yes," I said again. She laughed softly. "Wow," she said. That's very different from how I grew up. How so? I asked. In my family, she explained, my parents trust me to make my own decisions. She looked at the trees for a moment. They care, of course, but they don't expect to be part of every decision. That difference fascinated both of us. For a while we compared cultural traditions, food habits, holiday celebrations, family expectations, even small things like how often families call each other. These conversations were not only interesting, they were also powerful English practice. Talking about culture forces you to use descriptive language, explanations, and personal storytelling. But something else was also happening during those conversations. We were learning how to understand each other. Relationships between people from different cultures often require extra communication. Assumptions can easily cause confusion, but open conversations create clarity. One evening while walking near the river, Emily asked something more personal. Do you think relationships between people from different cultures are difficult? I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said honestly, but also interesting. She laughed. That's a diplomatic answer. What do you think? I asked. She kicked a small stone along the sidewalk as we walked. I think they can work, she said slowly. But both people have to be curious about each other's world. Curiosity. That word stayed in my mind. Curiosity is one of the most important qualities in both language learning and relationships. When you are curious, you ask questions. When you ask questions, you learn. And when people feel understood, connection grows stronger. By that point, something had become clear between us. Our friendship was becoming something deeper. We were no longer just two people practicing English. We were two people building understanding between two different worlds. One evening, after dinner at a small restaurant, Emily looked at me thoughtfully. You know something? She said.
What?
When we first met, I thought I was helping you practice English. And now? I asked. She smiled. Now I think we're both learning something. I raised an eyebrow playfully. What are you learning? She thought for a moment. Patience, she said. And maybe a little about how big the world really is. I laughed. And I am learning many things too. Like what? It is also a place where strangers can become important to each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because sometimes the truth of a moment sits quietly in the air, and both people can feel it. Our journey was slowly moving toward something bigger than friendship. But with deeper connection also comes bigger questions. Questions about commitment, about future plans, about whether two people from different cultures could truly build a life together. And soon, those questions would lead us to the next step in our story. A step that would bring joy, uncertainty, and a brand new chapter in the middle of the busiest city in America. Marriage in a busy city. New York has a strange way of making big life decisions feel both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. One moment you are just walking down a crowded street with thousands of strangers. The next moment, your life quietly changes direction. By the time summer arrived, Emily and I had been spending time together for many months. What began as short conversations over coffee had slowly grown into long walks, shared meals, and deep discussions about culture, family, and life. Somewhere along the way, something important became clear. We were no longer just friends, But recognizing that feeling and deciding what to do about it are two very different things. One evening we were sitting in a small park in Brooklyn. The city's skyline glowed in the distance, and the air carried the warm sound of people laughing, playing music, and enjoying the summer night. Emily looked at the skyline for a long moment. "Do you ever think about how many stories are happening in this city right now?" she asked. I followed her gaze toward the tall buildings. "Millions," I said. "Exactly," she replied. "And somehow our story found its way into this giant place." Her words made me smile, because she was right. In a city of more than 8 million people, two strangers from different worlds had somehow met in a small coffee shop. But that night, the conversation felt more serious than usual. After a moment, she asked quietly, "Do you ever think about the future?" This question always carries weight. "Yes," I said. And I took a slow breath. My future used to feel very uncertain, I admitted. New country, new language, everything new. She nodded gently. "But now," she asked. I looked at her. "Now the future feels less lonely." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she smiled softly. "That's a very honest answer." Relationships often grow through thousands of small moments rather than one dramatic event. Every conversation we had about language, culture, family, and dreams had quietly built trust between us. Psychologists describe this as emotional accumulation. Each positive interaction adds a small amount of trust and connection. Over time, those small moments become a strong foundation. And that foundation was now asking an important question. What comes next? Emily broke the silence. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when people think about relationships in New York, they imagine chaos." "Chaos?" I asked. "Yeah," she laughed. "Fast dating, busy careers, people always moving on to the next thing." She shrugged. "But our story doesn't feel like that." "No," I agreed. "It feels calm." That calmness surprised both of us. Because New York itself is rarely calm. Subways roar through underground tunnels. Traffic fills the streets. People rush everywhere like they are racing invisible clocks. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that movement, our relationship had grown slowly and naturally, like learning a language, step by step, sentence by sentence, conversation by conversation. One evening, while walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, Emily suddenly stopped. The city lights reflected on the water below us. "Can I ask you something serious?" she said. My heart beat slightly faster.
"Yes."
She looked at me directly. "Do you see a future for us?" It was a simple question, but behind it lived many other questions. Could two people from different cultures build a life together? Could someone who once struggled to order coffee in English build a family in the city? Could love grow strong enough to survive the challenges of real life? I answered slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Yes," I said. "But I also know it will require effort." She nodded. "Everything meaningful does." We continued walking for a few minutes, both thinking quietly. Then I said something that had been growing in my mind for weeks. "In my culture," I explained slowly, "marriage is not only about two people. It is also about families and commitment." Emily listened carefully. "I respect that," she said. "But for me," she continued, "marriage is also about partnership. two people choosing to build a life together. Our perspectives were slightly different, but they were not incompatible. In fact, they complemented each other. Her independence, my family-centered thinking. Together, they created balance. Finally, she smiled and said something that made me laugh. You know, our relationship might actually be the most international project I've ever worked on. International project? I repeated. Of course, she said playfully. 2 cultures, 2 languages, 1 busy city. I laughed. Then we should manage the project carefully. Agreed, she said. And sometime later that year, in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends, we made a decision that once felt impossible. We got married. No giant movie scene. No dramatic music. Just 2 people who had spent months learning each other's worlds. And choosing to keep learning together. Marriage in New York didn't suddenly make life simple. In fact, it introduced new challenges. Careers.
Finals.
Family expectations. But it also created something powerful. A shared life. A shared language. And the beginning of a new chapter neither of us had imagined when we first met across a coffee counter. Because soon, our small family story would grow even bigger. A new chapter was waiting. A chapter filled with sleepless nights, laughter, toys on the floor, and a very different kind of language practice. The language of raising children. Children, language, and home. People often say New York never sleeps. But when you have children, you discover something surprising. Your home also never sleeps. Not really. Because babies don't follow city schedules. They don't care about work meetings, subway delays, or the quiet hours of the night. They cry at 2 a.m. They laugh at 6 a.m. And somehow they completely reorganize your life without asking permission. When Emily and I first learned we were going to have a baby, I remember feeling 2 strong emotions at the same time.
Joy.
And panic. Joy, because we were starting a family together. Panic, because my brain suddenly asked a terrifying question. How will I raise a child in my second language? Language is not just communication between adults. It becomes even more important when you are teaching a child how to understand the world. Every parent becomes a teacher. And I wondered if my English would be enough. One evening, while we were preparing the baby's room, I shared that fear with Emily. I worry about something, I admitted. She looked up from assembling a small wooden crib. What's that? I worry that my English is still not perfect, I said slowly. What if I teach our child mistakes? Emily paused, then smiled. First of all, she said, every parent makes mistakes. She tightened one of the screws on the crib and continued. Second, children don't just learn language from grammar. They learn it from love, repetition, and conversation. What she said was actually supported by research in child language development. Children learn language through interaction, not perfection. They listen to thousands of small conversations every day. Over time, their brains naturally organize sounds, words, and meanings. Perfection is not required. Presence is. When our first child was born, I quickly discovered how true that was. Babies don't judge pronunciation. They respond to tone, warmth, and attention. I remember holding my daughter in the quiet living room one evening while the city lights blinked outside the window. She looked at me with wide, curious eyes. So I spoke to her in the same slow English style I had practiced years earlier. "Hello, little one," I said softly. "My name is Dad." She blinked. "Welcome to New York." Emily laughed from the couch. That might be the most New York introduction ever. But those moments became our new language practice. Every day, I described small things to her. "The sun is shining today. We're going to the park. Look at the big trees." Simple sentences. Clear pronunciation. Slow rhythm. Exactly the same learning style that had helped me when I first arrived in the city. And something beautiful happened. Teaching language to a child also strengthened my own English. Psychologists call this the teacher effect. When you explain things to others, your brain organizes knowledge more clearly. So bedtime stories became my favorite activity. Every night I read simple books out loud. At first I chose children's books because they were easy. But those books were surprisingly powerful for language practice. Short sentences, clear storytelling, strong emotions, and a lot of repetition. Our daughter listened carefully, sometimes pointing at pictures. "Dog," she would say proudly. "Yes," I replied. "Dog." Sometimes she mixed words from different languages. "Mommy nuoc," she once said, combining English and Vietnamese. Emily laughed. We're raising a multilingual human. Children growing up in bilingual homes often mix languages at first. Linguists call this code mixing, and it's a normal part of development. Eventually, their brains learn to separate the languages. But during those early years, our home sounded like a small international conversation. English,
Vietnamese,
sometimes both in the same sentence. And slowly our family rhythm developed. Mornings were busy. Emily prepared breakfast, while I helped our daughter practice simple words. Milk, bread, apple. Sometimes our daughter corrected my pronunciation in a funny way. "Daddy, say it like this," she would say confidently. Children love being teachers too. Life became full of new responsibilities. Work schedules, doctor visits, school planning. But despite the busy routine, something important remained the same. Our home was still a place of conversation. Dinner time often turned into storytelling time. Emily shared stories from her childhood. I shared stories from mine. Our daughter listened, absorbing two cultures at once. And occasionally she asked questions that made us pause. "Why does Dad speak differently?" she once asked Emily. Emily smiled. "Because Dad learned English in a very special way." Our daughter looked curious.
how? Emily pointed at me.
"He learned by telling stories." That answer made me smile, because it was true. From lonely nights in a tiny apartment, to coffee shop conversations, to family bedtime stories, language had always grown through storytelling. And now our daughter was part of that story too. But time moves quickly. Children grow faster than parents expect. And one day, years later, I would stand in the same city where I once felt completely lost and realize something incredible. New York was no longer just the place where I survived. It had become the place where I built a life, a family, a home. And the final chapter of this story was waiting. A moment of reflection. A moment to look back at the long journey from confused language learner to something I never imagined. Someone who had found love in the busiest city in the world. Surviving New York, finding love. If you had told me years ago that my life in New York would look like this, I probably would have laughed in disbelief. Because the first version of my New York story was very different. It began with confusion, with slow English, with lonely nights in a small apartment where I practiced simple sentences out loud just to build confidence. Back then, the city felt enormous and indifferent. Millions of people moved quickly around me, each carrying their own stories, their own worries, their own dreams. And I was just trying to survive inside it. But life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes the place that feels the most overwhelming becomes the place where your story quietly transforms. Years later, when I walk through the same streets now, the city feels completely different. Not because New York has changed, but because I have changed. I still remember those early mornings in the small coffee shop. The smell of fresh coffee. The sound of people ordering drinks. The nervous feeling in my chest when I tried to say a simple sentence in English. Hi, can I get a small coffee, please? That sentence was once my daily challenge. Now it feels like the opening line of an entire chapter of my life. Because behind that small sentence was the beginning of everything that followed. Meeting Emily. Learning about American culture. Building conversations that slowly turned into connection. Connection that slowly turned into love. And love that eventually turned into a family. When I look back, I realize something important about language learning. Language is never just about grammar. It is about belonging. When you learn a language, you are not only memorizing vocabulary. You are learning how to participate in another world. You learn how people joke, how they express emotions, how they share stories. And stories are the foundation of human connection. Scientists studying human communication often describe storytelling as one of the most powerful learning tools. Stories activate multiple parts of the brain at once: memory, emotion, imagination. That's why learning English through stories can feel easier than memorizing long lists of words. Because stories are how humans naturally understand life. And my English journey was always a story. A story about curiosity. A story about patience. A story about not quitting even when progress felt painfully slow. Sometimes people ask me a question. How did you manage to learn English well enough to build a life in the United States? My answer is always simple. I practiced every day, even when it felt uncomfortable. Not in perfect classrooms, not with complicated textbooks, but through real conversations, through listening, through repeating sentences, through telling my own story again and again in simple English. Language experts often say something very true. Consistency beats intensity. You don't need to study 10 hours in one day. But practicing a little every day, listening, speaking, reading, gradually transforms the brain. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and build new connections over time. Each small conversation becomes another pathway in your mind. Each story you tell becomes another step toward fluency. And sometimes, those conversations lead to something even more meaningful. Connection with another person.
Love.
Family. One evening not long ago, I stood again on the Brooklyn Bridge with Emily and our daughter. The same bridge where years earlier we had talked about our uncertain future. The skyline looked just as bright as it always had. Cars rushed across the bridge. Tourists took photos. The city continued its endless rhythm. but my perspective had changed completely. Our daughter pointed toward the tall buildings. "Dad," she asked, "did you always live here?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I came here a long time ago." "Were you scared?" she asked. I thought about that question. "Yes," I admitted. "A little." Emily squeezed my hand gently. Then our daughter asked another question. "Then why did you stay?" I looked out at the glowing city lights. Because the answer was standing right beside me. I stayed, I said slowly, because this city gave me something special. "What?" she asked. I looked at Emily. It gave me a story. And that story taught me something powerful. Sometimes the places that test you the most are the places that help you grow the most. Sometimes the language that once felt impossible becomes the language of your home. And sometimes, in the busiest city in the world, love grows quietly in the most ordinary places. Maybe in a small coffee shop. Maybe in a simple conversation. Maybe in a sentence that once felt difficult to say. So if you're learning English right now, and sometimes you feel tired or discouraged, remember this. Progress doesn't always happen loudly. Sometimes it grows slowly, like a quiet story unfolding day by day. One sentence. One conversation. One moment of courage at a time. And who knows? Maybe your English journey will also lead you somewhere unexpected. Somewhere filled with new friendships, new opportunities, and maybe even love. Because sometimes surviving a big city is not the real challenge. The real surprise is discovering how much life and how much happiness can grow there. The truth is, learning English is not only about grammar or vocabulary. Sometimes it begins with a simple sentence in a small coffee shop in a city that never slows down. My journey started with slow English, small conversations, and many mistakes. But those small moments slowly turned into confidence, friendship, love, and finally a family. So, if you're learning English right now and feel like giving up, remember this. Your story is still being written. Maybe your next conversation will change something. Maybe your next small step will open a new door. And maybe, just like my story in New York, your English journey will lead you somewhere you never expected. If you enjoyed this real English story practice, make sure to subscribe to the channel because more slow English listening stories, real-life conversations, and inspiring English learning journeys are coming soon. Write in the comments, "I'm still learning English." Because every learner has a story, and I would love to hear yours. And remember, sometimes the biggest change in life starts with the smallest sentence. See you in the next story.